ocean liners, following their history from 1897 onward. Although they may have fallen out of fashion as a traveling method, they have certainly not been forgotten. This is especially true for Brian, who's been fascinated by everything to do with these ships since 4 years old. Throughout his life, he has researched the history of ocean liners, collected items from them, and has even made transatlantic crossings on 3 different ships. Needless to say, if you're looking for an expert on ocean liners, you've come to the right place. So please join me in welcoming Brian Dudley.
Thank you, Fallon, and welcome everybody. I appreciate you coming out tonight. Before we begin, can anyone tell me the difference between a cruise ship and an ocean liner? Yes?
Deep hull versus sort of flat hull.
Structurally, that's one characteristic. But also, a cruise ship embarks on a voyage for the pleasure of its passengers, meandering from port to port for rest and relaxation. Whereas an ocean liner has a very specific purpose to transport its passengers from point A to point B on a line voyage, hence the name liner. Tonight we're going to be focusing on the ships of the North Atlantic run. The North Atlantic obviously is the bridge between the New World and Europe. It was the most lucrative and the most prestigious ocean route, and some would argue that it is also the most dangerous ocean route, even surpassing the hazards of Cape Horn. So, picking the starting point of the golden age of ocean liners is somewhat arbitrary, but I chose 1897 for 2 reasons. 1, an audacious stunt, and 2, it was the advent of the first true superliner. In 1897, the British Admiralty organized a naval review at Spithead to help celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. It was an impressive display of warships and merchant ships when all of a sudden this slender yacht just darted out from nowhere, belching smoke and fire and traveling at an astonishing speed of 34 knots. It was weaving in and out among the flotilla and evaded the naval picket dispatched to intercept it. This was Charles Parsons' Turbinia, and it was a brazen exhibition of the potential of his newly developed steam turbine engine. 1897 also saw the introduction of the prototypical superliner. Norddeutscher Lloyds, or North German Lloyds, Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse combined luxury, speed, size, power, and she was the first ship to sport 4 funnels. Since he acceded to the throne, Kaiser Wilhelm II was determined to challenge Britain's political, economic, and naval superiority, and establishing a maritime supremacy was one way to do that. The Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse captured the mythical Blue Ribbon for speed as the fastest ocean liner, and soon captivated the imagination of the ocean-going public. And over the next 10 years, NVL trotted out 3 more liners, each larger than the last, and in some cases faster. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Crown Princess in Cecily, and the Crown Prince Wilhelm. They all exhibited the apex in luxury and comfort. NVL's main German rival, the Hamburg American liner Hapag, didn't want to be left out. They wanted to also achieve status as a top-tier shipping line. So under the direction of 31-year-old Albert Ballin, they introduced the Deutschland. And she soon captured the Blue Ribbon for speed, but at somewhat of a cost. She suffered from such severe vibration that it actually affected her structural integrity. So for this reason, and because of the high cost of operating her, Hapag withdrew her from the North Atlantic service in 1906 and converted her to a slower luxury cruise ship. But one legacy was that she introduced the concept of an extra tariff restaurant. It was an alternative dining venue for first-class passengers. Also around the turn of the century, the American financier J.P. Morgan decided to assemble a stable of shipping lines under the banner of International Mercantile Marine. He acquired American lines, Dutch, Belgian lines and several smaller British lines. But his crown jewel was the acquisition in 1901 of Britain's White Star Line, at that time the most profitable line on the Atlantic, and second only in prestige and notoriety to Britain's other famous line, Cunard. And while NDL and Hapag nominally were independent lines, IMM had a significant minority stake in them. That left only the French line and Cunard as truly free of Morgan's influence. So, with Germany's maritime ascendancy over the past decade, the threat of a hostile takeover from an American interest, the need to maintain Britain's supremacy on the seas, the British government agreed to provide a subsidy to Cunard to build 2 superliners. But the condition was that they had to be built to Admiralty standards so that they could be converted to armed merchant cruisers if needed in time of war. So, with contracts signed in 1905, Cunard took the extraordinary step of outfitting both of these ships with Parsons' turbine engine only 8 years after Spithead. The Lusitania was first. She was 80 feet longer than her nearest German rival, about a third again as big in regard to gross tonnage. And she completed her maiden voyage in September of 1907. It would take until October of 1907 for her to get the speed record. And here she is, the world's greatest technological achievement, being met pierside in New York by horse and buggy. Her westbound voyage was completed at a speed of just under 24 knots, which is about 3/4 of a knot faster than the Deutschland, and she was the first ship to traverse the Atlantic in less than 5 days. Over the course of her short career, she would increase her maximum speed to 25.5 knots. Her sister ship, Mauretania, made her maiden voyage in November of 1907. She achieved an eastbound record crossing and would hold on to that speed record for the next 22 years. It took until 1909 for her to wrest the westbound record from her sister, but once she had it, she was the undisputed speed queen of the Atlantic. To say that her upper decks were cluttered would be somewhat of an understatement, given these large cowled ventilators, in contrast to the much sleeker flat-top ventilators on her sister, the Lusitania. But I really like this picture because it shows in a single frame all 4 funnels lined up in a row. And incidentally, this was taken by Walter Lord, who would later achieve fame as the author of the book about the Titanic, A Night to Remember. With the success of the Lusitania and the Mauretania, the other shipping lines decided that they were going to forego competition for speed and instead focus on luxury and comfort. White Star's answer to Cunard was to be a trio of ships that, at almost 900 feet long and at 46,000 gross tons, were half again as large as Lusitania and Mauretania. The first was the Olympic, a 4-funnel liner, but in this case, her 4th funnel was a dummy. See, while most people focused on luxurious appointments in first class and the comings and goings of high society, the real economic engine of these shipping lines was the immigrant trade. And to unsophisticated travelers, the number of funnels indicated the safety and reliability of the ship. So if you had to resort to a little bit of trickery to make the numbers work, that's what you did. Her sister ship, the Titanic, needs no introduction. She's probably the most famous ship in the world, and you can see her distinguished from the Olympic by her semi-enclosed promenade deck on A deck. And this was to protect passengers from ocean spray. Occasionally, first-class passengers on the Olympic got drenched. At the time of her maiden voyage, she was the longest and largest ship in the world. But that maiden voyage was tragically cut short when she collided with an iceberg and sank on the evening of April 14th and 15th, 1912, with the loss of over 1,500 lives. Making her maiden voyage a mere 6 days after the Titanic disaster, the French line's France debuted seemingly under a very black cloud. But with her decor, her magnificent cuisine, she soon was known as the Chateau of the Atlantic. And despite being a notorious roller in rough seas, she was a favorite of both first-class and immigrant passengers alike. Albert Ballin was determined to make Hapag the preeminent line on the North Atlantic. So he proposed a trio of ships, often known as Ballin's Big Three. The first was the Imperator. She had that eagle figurehead, which didn't last long. It was partially blown off in the storm and then eventually removed altogether. She was the first ship to be over 900 feet long, the first ship to be over 50,000 gross tons. She had luxurious appointments, including a lot of marble, which tended to make her top-heavy, thus earning her the nickname Limperata. The second ship was the Fatherland. The third ship, launched in 1914 but sitting out World War I, was the Bismarck. She would never sail for Hapag. The Aquitania was the last of the North Atlantic's four-funneled liners. She was known as the Ship Beautiful. As a running mate to the Lusitania and the Mauretania, Cunard finally had achieved its goal of a 3-ship weekly service between New York and Europe. So, we've been talking about the evolution of these early liners, but they were not impersonal floating boxes. So why don't we take a step back for a minute and see what it was like on board. During the days of sail and the early days of steam, an ocean voyage was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. However, with advances in naval architecture, ship safety and reliability greatly improved the shipboard experience. But ship owners still wanted their passengers to forget that they were at sea. So they sort of transposed the grand architecture of hotels, of manor houses, of municipal buildings, even railway stations, on board these ships. That accounts for a variety of styles that you saw, from Jacobean to Georgian to Louis XIV to Louis XVI. And Johannes Popp, a noted Bremen architect, is considered the innovator who brought this style of interior decoration to sea. This is his first-class dining room on the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. And if you recall, the four funnels were arranged in pairs with a space in between them. Well, this allowed the first-class dining room to extend the entire width of the ship. And you can see his Beaux Arts sensibilities in this design, but you'll also notice the rather long dormitory-style tables and swivel chairs bolted to the deck. Ship stability hadn't quite come that far yet. Here you can see an extension of the grandiosity of design in the dining room of the Kaiser Wilhelm II, extending up through 3 decks surmounted with a glass dome. This is an entrance hall on the Deutschland. And here it is populated with people getting ready to go for dinner. Because they were now in familiar surroundings, they also assumed familiar customs, such as dressing for dinner, which now became de rigueur on these ships in first class, except for the first and last night of the voyage. This is an example of a smoking room on board the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. It is rather claustrophobic. It mimics a German inn, but it was an exclusively male preserve. No women allowed. Now that's in contrast to the smoking room on the France, much more open, more airy, less claustrophobic, but still a male preserve. And regardless of what you call these rooms, whether they were reading and writing rooms, drawing rooms, or lady salons, this is where the female passengers were exiled after dinner while the men enjoyed brandy and cigars in the smoking room. Unlike the smoking room, the presence of male passengers, while not exactly welcome, was at least tolerated. And here is the first-class dining room on the Lusitania, designed in Louis XVI style. And you'll notice the mezzanine on top. Originally, that was going to be an extra tariff restaurant, but Cunard didn't like this idea of a special class of first class. So instead, it just became an extension of the first-class dining room. But you'll notice much smaller tables, more intimate, more cozy, more comfortable, but still with swivel chairs bolted to the decks. This is a grand staircase on board the Titanic and conveys an impression of the luxury that White Star imparted on its ships. You'll notice wood paneling, filigree, iron railing. She also sported a Turkish bath, a squash court, a swimming pool, a Parisian cafe, not to mention comfy cabins. Charles Mevis was an Alsatian architect who had designed both the Ritz hotels in London and Paris. He came to Albert Ballin's attention, and Ballin hired him as the unofficial architect for Hapag. And he designed the interiors of the big three, and having overall charge of that, was able to provide a more cohesive design philosophy, still relying on period revivalism, but not the same hodgepodge that you saw in other liners. This shows his winter garden leading into the extra tariff Ritz restaurant on board the Imperato. His protege and business partner, Arthur Davis, was commissioned by Cunard to design the interiors of the Aquitania. This is the Palladium Lounge, which is considered one of the most beautiful rooms ever put to sea. And you'll notice up top, that painting, well, it was taken from a Georgian manor and installed intact on the ceiling. And while the French may not have invented the idea of a staircase entering the restaurant, they certainly perfected the art of what was called the grounds of the sun. Here, women in their finest gowns would pause on the landing, ostensibly to look for their table, but making sure that all eyes were upon them as they floated down the stairs with their gentleman companion assuring them that they were the most beautiful woman in the room. To his credit, because Albert Ballin had cut his teeth in the immigrant trade, he wanted to make sure that immigrants at least had a comfortable passage. He didn't want them herded like cattle. And in fact, immigrant space took up what had previously been the space that cattle occupied when they were transported across the Atlantic, hence the name steerage. That philosophy went across all the shipping lines, and here you can see the third-class dining room of the Lusitania. Not uncomfortable, certainly not as luxurious as first and second class, but certainly serviceable. And here is the general room, the third-class general room on the Titanic. And one thing to remember is that even though these rooms may seem rather sparse, both the accommodations and the food served on board were better than what many immigrants had ever experienced back home in the old country. As World War I broke out, many of the German ships on this side of the Atlantic tried to evade hastily assembled blockades. Some were successful, some weren't, such as this quartet that is moored in the Chesapeake Bay, and to the extreme right is the Crown Princess Cecily. Many of these liners were requisitioned for war service, whether they had been subsidized by the Admiralty or not. Here is the Olympic, outfitted as a troop transport. And her dazzle camouflage paint was designed to confuse targeting by both surface warships and U-boats. And this is the Mauritania in her dazzle paint. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was struck by a torpedo from a U-boat off the old head of Kinsale in the Irish Sea. She sank in 18 minutes with a loss of over 1,100 lives. And that's compared to the 2.5 hours that it took the Titanic to sink. The last of White Star's planned trio, the Britannic, had been immediately requisitioned as a hospital ship. And in November of 1916, she struck a mine in the Aegean Sea and sank with a loss of 30 lives, but miraculously 1,100 were saved. She never made a commercial voyage. The interwar years brought advancements in ship design, in naval architectural engineering theory, in decor, and introduced the concept of ships of state. It also was an era of societal change. Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which severely curtailed immigration into the United States. So the shipping lines had to scramble to find some way to make up that lost revenue. Hence, the concept of tourist class, a tourist third cabin, was born, and it provided an affordable means for students, teachers, clergymen, ex-GIs wanting to go to Europe with their family to cross the Atlantic. But there were war reparations. Cunard got the Imperator, renamed it the Berengaria for the loss of the Lusitania. The Bismarck became White Star's Majestic for the loss of the Britannic. And the Vaterland actually had been impounded by the U.S. government in Boken, and when the U.S. entered the war, she was converted to a troop transport and renamed Leviathan. After the war, retaining the name Leviathan, she was reconverted to a passenger ship. And she's probably the most famous ship that nobody has ever heard of. She even has a 6-volume history written about her. The Paris was laid down in 1916, but obviously had to sit out the war and made her maiden voyage in 1921. She was sort of the bridge between the Belle Epoque and the new modern art and architectural standard. Here you can see her main entrance hall, a very distinct Moroccan style, not reliant on period revivalism, and it was a way of trying to establish a new style for ocean liners. And if the Paris was a tentative foray into art modernism, then the Ile-de-France was a full-fledged revolution. She employed Art Deco and debuted in 1927 with astounding interiors, as seen here with her first-class restaurant. She soon became the ship of choice for discerning clientele, not only because of her appointments, but also because of her magnificent French cuisine. It was often said that more seagulls followed French ships than any other. But in a post-World War II refit, she lost some of her initial panache, as you can see in a sort of sanitized version of that first-class restaurant, and the difference between the pre- and post-war entrance halls. It even cost her one of her funds. And she met a rather ignominious end when she was sold for scrap to Japanese shipbringers who thought that they could eke out a little bit of extra money by renting her to Hollywood as a soundstage and a backdrop for a movie called The Last Voyage with Robert Stack and Dorothy Malone. And if you ever come across it late at night on TCM, don't bother.
Take the ambient.
The French were so outraged that all future contracts for scrap sales specified that their ships were to be sold for scrap and no other purpose. Germany was determined to emerge from the humiliation of World War I. So, Norddeutscher Lloyd introduced a pair of ships that were designed to retake the blue ribbon. They were also the first examples of ships of state. And here you can see the first of the ships, Bremen, with its sleek, curved front on its superstructure and its very suave funnels, displaying an impression of aggressive power and speed. However, those squat funnels deposited a lot of soot and smoke on deck and first-class passenger clothes, so that in short order, as seen here on her sister ship, the Europa, the size of those funnels was lengthened. And it wasn't only exterior lines above the waterline that showed innovation, but also below the waterline. And here you can see the incorporation of the bulbous bow. Now, this had been a concept used in warships from around the turn of the century, but this was the first time that it was really employed on a major ocean liner. And it was designed to reduce drag, improve hydrodynamic efficiency, so that you could maintain the same speed and reduce horsepower. And here you can see in profile, with a cruiser stern rather than the more traditional counter stern, the emergence of a classic ocean liner profile. The Bremen debuted in 1929, took the blue ribbon. The Europa followed a year later because she had been delayed by a fire at the shipyard, which required complete rebuilding of her interiors. But once the two of them were running mates, they traded the blue ribbon back and forth for the next 3 years. The Bremen, as you can see here in its first-class lounge, relied on a more modern style. Her designers talked about purity of form and the superior quality of craftsmanship and the grace of line. Whereas in the ballroom on the Europa, it was more traditional, but still not overly ostentatious. In the 1930s, Mussolini wanted to attract American tourists and their dollars. So he introduced a pair of ships, the Rex and the Conte de Savoia. They were built for speed and designed to reduce the time of passage from New York to Genoa from 10 days to 6.5 days. You could distinguish them by their profiles, the Rex having the counter stern and the Conte de Savoia having the cruiser stern. The Rex relied more on inspiration from Italian villas and palazzos. The Conte de Savoia relied on cleaner lines, as seen here in the main entrance hall, except for this. This is the Galleria Colonna, which is a visual cacophony that is so dizzyingly chaotic, I think I would have been seasick even if it was on land. It was completely out of place with the more modern decor of the ship, but it was said that it was a concession to the more conservative members of the Italian line directorate. And now we come to the Normandy, probably one of the most celebrated liners of all time. And if the history of the Leviathan could fill a 6-volume set, then the story of the Normandy could probably fill an entire set of encyclopedias. Her naval architect was Vladimir Yorkovich, a Russian immigrant. He had helped pioneer the use of the bulbous bow, and his design for a flared upper hull was all part and parcel of improving performance. Below the waterline, the bulbous bow improved hydrodynamic efficiency. Above the waterline, the flared hull improved aerodynamic efficiency, all trying to reduce drag. And with her raked funnels, each one successively shorter, addressing aft. And with this sheer line in her profile, she exhibits grace and an impression of speed. Now, her main rival during the 30s was the Queen Mary. And while the Queen Mary eventually captured the Blue Ribbon just by a fraction of a knot, they really achieved virtually the same speed. However, the Normandy was able to do that with 160,000 horsepower as opposed to 212,000 horsepower for the Queen Mary. She also employed the idea of split funnel uptakes. It wasn't unique to the Normandy, it had been used in other ships, but basically the idea was that the exhaust gases from the boilers came up the sides of the ship and then converged to the top deck with the funnels. This allowed an uninterrupted longitudinal sweep here along the promenade deck, from the theater to the main entrance hall to the gallery to this magnificent Art Deco grand salon, which proceeded aft to this equally beautiful smoking room, by now accepting women and men. And then further aft, this sweeping staircase that went up to the boat deck to the grill restaurant. And that statue, La Normandie, eventually made its way to the Hotel Fontainebleau in Miami. This is her first-class restaurant, longer than the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. It was a place to see and be seen. Now, with so much space dedicated to first class, inevitably second and third class would suffer. But this room, the second class dining room, really is quite elegant. And in parts, I think, an intimacy and coziness that is in contrast to the imposing grandeur of the first class restaurant. And even the third class restaurant was serviceable and comfortable. And while third class recreational spaces were relegated aft, this covered promenade at least provided for deck chairs, shuffleboard, and table tennis. Work stopped on both the Normandy and Cunard's new build, known as Hull 534, during the Depression. The Normandy emerged first in 1935, and then what would become the Queen Mary followed in 1936. She was completed with a heavy government subsidy, a condition of which was that Cunard and White Star merged into a single line. Cunard had a majority stake, and by the 1960s, White Star no longer existed as a shipping entity on the Atlantic. She was known as the stateliest ship. She had none of the technological advances of the Normandy. She had none of the design advances of the Normandy. But for some reason, she was loved by crew and passengers alike. The Normandy was admired, but the Queen Mary was loved. She had an indefinable charisma that endeared her to the world. Although at first, not everyone was impressed. People were extremely disappointed by her appointments. She was designed by Arthur Davis, remember, he designed the Aquitania. And he did not embrace modernism or Art Deco, but not exactly all the traditional elements of period of revivalism either. He had a lot of polished wood and marquetry. And this is an example of, in her first class main entrance leading into the shopping promenade. Her first class restaurant had a glass mural that would track the progress across the Atlantic of the Queen Mary herself, and later, with her running mate, the Queen Elizabeth, as they crossed in opposite directions. And this is the observation lounge. This room would become a staple on all future queens. Her first class smoking room was admired by some for its polished wood, its intricate carved friezes, but others found it very cold imposing. Whatever your opinion was, there seemed to be genuine agreement and amusement about the choice of artwork. Edward Wadsworth's At Sea and Dressed Overall at Key. The Queen Elizabeth's keel was laid in 1936. Work was slowed down as tensions arose on the continent and production shifted to the war effort. But by 1940, the shell had been completed. There was enough of her interior and basic plumbing and electrical systems installed so that Churchill ordered a super secret maiden voyage in a mad dash across the Atlantic to escape German bombers. She arrived in New York to be outfitted as a troop transport. And this is a scene that would never be repeated in peacetime. The second Mauretania at the top, followed by the Normandy, the Queen Mary, and the Queen Elizabeth. Even the old Aquitania was pressed into war service as a transport, the only major liner to serve in both world wars. Churchill said that the Queen shortened the war by a year. The Queen Elizabeth carried a record 16,000 troops on one voyage, and both ships would routinely carry 13 to 14,000 in order to deposit them anywhere in the world where they were needed. On February 9, 1942, while being outfitted for war service, the Normandy caught fire in New York Harbor and capsized the next day, never to sail again. She wasn't the only casualty. The Bremen, the Rex, the Conte de Savoia, the Paris would not survive the war. The Europa did, but only to serve as the French line's liberty. In 1946, the Queen Elizabeth made her first commercial voyage after having already steamed over 500,000 miles. She was a bridge between the 1930s and a new sense of optimism post-war, with somewhat traditional, not innovative design. But, as you can see here in her first-class restaurant, she was an elegant and graceful ship, and she never achieved the same level of affection as the Queen Mary, which to me is rather a shame because I always thought that she was more beautiful. This is her observation lounge and her grand salon, extending up through 2 decks, and a publicity still. Can anyone recognize the male model? That's Roger Moore.
Oh,
This is her cabin class lounge and her 3rd class lounge. In 1958, a record 1.2 million passengers crossed the Atlantic by ship. But it was also the debut of the Boeing 707. And I know that's a DC-8 in the picture. But by 1959, 1.5 million crossed by air, and only a fraction of that by sea. The writing was on the wall, obvious to everyone except Cunard, who proclaimed that the jet was just a passing phase. In the late 1940s, America decided that they were going to once again engage in the transatlantic trade in a big way. So in February of 1950, the keel of the SS United States was laid. She was designed by William Francis Gibbs, a lawyer by training, but a self-taught naval architect by sheer determination. This ship was a technological marvel. And just think about that. A self-taught naval architect created what is likely to be the fastest passenger liner ever to sail the oceans. On her speed trials, she achieved the speed of 38 knots, which is equivalent to about 45 land miles per hour. Her maiden voyage was a tremendous success. She captured the east and westbound blue ribbon by a wide margin, crossing the ocean in 3.5 days. Her westbound voyage speed was 35.59 knots, 41 miles per hour. And when she arrived in Southampton, the British magazine Punch said, after all the loud and fantastic claims made about the new liner United States, it comes as something of a disappointment to find they're all true. Because she was built to naval specifications for conversion to troop transport within 48 hours, and because of William Francis Gibbs' obsession with fireproofing the ship, her designers were limited in both space and choice of materials, but somehow they made it work. Her first-class restaurant, her second-class restaurant, and her third-class restaurant. And what's interesting is that while forays between classes on all other liners was officially discouraged but somewhat grudgingly tolerated, there was no such allowance on the United States. Class divisions on an American ship were strictly enforced. This is her first-class Navajo lounge with sand paintings inspired by Native American art. Her cabin-class smoking room known as the Harlequin Bar. And her swimming pool didn't have the Pompeian proportions of other ships, but it welcomed first and tourist-class passengers with the signal flags spelling out, "Come on in, the water's fine." While third-class passengers were supposed to have access to the swimming pool, somehow they never did. In the early 1950s, the Italians produced a pair of beautiful ships, the Andrea Doria and the Cristoforo Colombo. They were elegant, as you can see here with the Andrea Doria's first-class restaurant. But on July 25th, near midnight, 1956, she was rammed in a fog bank by the Swedish-American liner Stockholm off the coast of Nantucket and sank the next day with a loss of 51 lives. The Dutch had always had a presence on the North Atlantic with many fine ships, but in 1959, they introduced an innovative liner. They dispensed with the idea of traditional funnels and instead had these twin stacks as smoke uptakes located aft. But even without traditional funnels, the Rotterdam did present a very graceful profile. And she was innovative on the inside too. The trend was coming to have two classes rather than three. And so instead of the traditional vertical separation, second class at the bow, first class centrally located amidship, third class aft, first and second class were separated horizontally by deck, each occupying every other deck. And in order to achieve this, she had a unique conceit, a hidden double staircase that allowed first and second class passengers to pass on the staircase without ever seeing each other. It was patterned after the double helix staircase in the Chateau Chambord in France, designed by Leonardo da Vinci. That was only for transatlantic crossings. With the ingenious use of movable partitions, when she was in cruising mode, all passengers had run of the ship. Her first-class restaurant, to me, is a little reminiscent of the Ile-de-France. And she had a very graceful Ritz-Carlton lounge in first class. The French line needed a successor to the Normandy, as both the Ile-de-France and the Liberté were nearing the end of their useful life. So in 1957, the keel of the France was laid, and she was launched in May of 1960 by none other than Madame de Gaulle. Here you can see hints of the Normandy in her hull design. And she had a traditional profile, but she had unique funnels too, with wings designed to try and carry the smoke up and away from the decks, although internal memos indicated that even with preliminary wind tunnel experiments, they didn't quite work the way they were designed. Being a successor of the Normandy, she had an impossible standard to live up to. And also, emerging from the industrial zeitgeist of the 50s and the 60s, her interiors probably probably were bound to disappoint, but they had a sort of antiseptic charm, as seen here in the first class lounge. But if there was one room that deserved all this criticism, it was the tourist class lounge. Even to an 11-year-old, me, it seemed like this was just a giant generic hotel lobby. But her first class smoking room was magnificent, extending up through 2 decks. And when she was later converted to the cruise ship Norway, this was one of only 2 rooms left intact and untouched. And this was the other, the first class restaurant. Craig Claiborne, the food critic for the New York Times, said that this was the finest French restaurant in the world. And while not as elegant, the tourist class restaurant still served the best of cuisine with complimentary bottles of white and red wine at lunch and dinner, as was custom on all French line ships. The first class swimming pool was in the bowels of the ship, but the tourist class swimming pool was covered by an immense glass dome, which was great for transatlantic crossings, but when she went on tropical cruises, it became oppressively steamy. And this first class bar, the Cabaret Atlantique, had a little bit of a secret. The promenade deck below had a stairway behind the shopping arcade. Late at night, tourist passengers legally could sneak up and have late night soirees mingling with first class passengers. For some reason, the Italian line thought in the 1960s they could make a go of it with a pair of new transatlantic liners. The Michelangelo and the Raffaello were beautiful ships, and they had unique latticework funnels, but they were doomed to be a commercial failure. And by 1976, they were serving as troop accommodations for the Iranian army. And remember how we said the North Atlantic was the most dangerous ocean? In 1966, the Michelangelo met a rogue wave, killing 2 passengers and 1 crewman. 1967, the Queen Mary was withdrawn, sold to Long Beach. 1968, Queen Elizabeth was withdrawn, sold to Port Everglades. In 1969, as the seemingly last grasp of transatlantic glory, Cunard gave us the Queen Elizabeth II. She was bound to break all bonds of tradition. They even eschewed the traditional funnel red-orange background with black bands for this white single stack. Her pre-maiden voyage brochures proclaimed that ships had been boring long enough. This is her lookout bar, her version of the observation lounge. However, it was lost in the 1972 refit when it was converted to a galley for additional restaurants and not replicated elsewhere on the ship. This is her midships lobby, the main entranceway. But it was also a very comfortable place to relax during a transatlantic voyage. This is the entrance to her original first-class restaurant. It bifurcated aft into 2 charming alleyways, starboard, the midships lounge, and to port, the bookstore and library. She was originally going to be a 3-class ship, and the tourist class lounge would be above, the 3rd class lounge would be below. But when it was finally decided that she was going to only be 2 classes, Dennis Lennon, her interior designer, took his eraser, removed the deck in between, and drew in this curved staircase, creating the double down room. It was one of the most celebrated rooms on the ship, but in subsequent refits, lost its initial charm when she was converted to the Grand Lounge, becoming the main entertainment venue on board. But no one could doubt her seaworthiness. Unfortunately, she couldn't escape war either. Here she is serving in the Falklands. In the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, Cunard had a series of owners, some good, some nearly disastrous. But by 1999, Carnival Corporation had completed acquisition of all of Cunard for $600 million, and they immediately sank almost that much into the design and construction of a new transatlantic liner, the Queen Mary II. She made her maiden voyage in 2004, classic lines with some modern touches, but also having an innovative propulsion system of diesel-electric pods rather than the traditional shaft and screw propellers. She's an imposing figure in whatever port she is in. She has clean, uncluttered decks with reminders of London Street's hydrant and a lamppost for special passengers. This is her iconic funnel. Her grand lobby is an atrium that extends up through 3 decks. And while officially she is a classless ship, the reality is that dining options are assigned based on the level of accommodation passengers have. This is her main restaurant, the Britannia restaurant, that has a beautiful tapestry dominating the center of the room. This is the Queen's Room, the restaurant for the most exclusive accommodations on board. This is her late night discotheque, G32. And this is her version of the observation bar, the Commodore Club. Shipping lines and their publicists loved to talk about the celebrities that are on board. This is Cary Grant and Marlena Dietrich on the Normandy, Clark Gable on the Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth Taylor on the Queen Elizabeth, Alfred Hitchcock on the France, and Bob Hope Oakley and Loretta Young on a Cunard ship. And then there are these two, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. They were loyal Cunard passengers until they weren't. Cunard finally got fed up with their insistence on paying minimum tourist fare while occupying the most exclusive first-class cabin, along with their baggage, their maids, and their 50 to 100 pieces of luggage. When Cunard finally put their foot down and said no more, for some reason, the United States line was more than willing to take up the slack and subsidize their twice-yearly transatlantic crossings. This is Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr, too. And while they may not be the most famous, they, to me, are the cutest. My son and my daughter on board the QE2. So thank you very much, and may you always have fair winds and following seas.